Tere tulemast kõigile. Welcome everyone. Tänane episood on inglise keeles. So today's episode will be in English. Ja nüüd ma lähengi üle inglise keelele. So now I will proceed in English. So my guest today is Jared Anderson. I consider him a good friend, and I'm happy that he's willing to be here today. And he will introduce himself in more detail. But I've known him a few years and grateful for his friendship. So my name is Kenneth Yogi, and just wanted to briefly introduce myself and the podcast to those who will be the first-time listeners. So I am a member of the LDS Church, been for about 22 years, and I have done this podcast since the summer. The goal of this podcast is to basically for me to enable to get to know people with different views. Mostly they have LDS background, but sometimes not. And so I just invite everyone to come with me, come along to my journey by via these podcasts. And yeah, so I guess that's enough about me. Let's talk about Jared's journey today. So Jared, why don't you introduce yourself first, about your relationship to the LDS Church and religion in general, what you're doing these days, and then we will go to and go through your entire faith journey.
Yeah, sounds great. Glad to be here. So I have the privilege of working as a chaplain, which I jokingly call the coolest job you've never heard of, because most people haven't heard of it. The technical definition of a chaplain, the root is chapel, like a church. And the technical term is a chaplain is a minister outside of a congregational setting. People are most familiar with chaplains in the military, at hospitals, universities, if you're very lucky. And my favorite way to describe what a chaplain is, though, is a professional, decent human being. And I feel deeply fortunate that I am able to make religion my life. As we'll discuss in detail, religion has always been deeply, deeply important to me. And I have also been very sensitive to the importance of religion generally, which is a broader topic, of course. So I taught religion for 13 years, and then toward the end of that, I felt my call to the ministry, as they say. I gently joke that in the LDS Church, we don't feel callings, we accept them. And so it took quite a while to recognize that I wanted to go into ministry, because again, there's not much room for that. And so, for example, and I'll circle back around to this, is as an undergraduate, I went through the seminary teacher training program, because that's the only option. Like if you want to, other than whatever callings you get to receive, the only religious vocation that we have control over is you can teach seminary or institute. That's about it. I don't know what it looks like in Estonia. So I, again, we'll circle back around to this, but I did my undergraduate at the University of Utah in Middle Eastern Studies with a Hebrew emphasis. And then I went to graduate school and studied under Bart Ehrman, who's a very famous biblical scholar. He's both famous for his scholarship and famous for his lack of faith in the evangelical community.
He's probably one of the best, let's say, known mainstream person who has had a faith transition.
Yes, no, he's a very good popularizer. and again, his own background, because he, again, we can circle back to this, just making a broad outline. He was a fundamentalist biblical literalist, which I think is one of the most tricky worldviews to have, because biblical literalists believe that every single word of the Bible is exactly the way God wants it. And that takes some very impressive mental gymnastics to maintain. Even more difficult than LDS mental gymnastics. So I did a PhD, walked away from a PhD in biblical studies, but I did all of the coursework. My dissertation was on reconstructing Matthew's version of Mark. So the author of Matthew literally had a scroll of the Gospel of Mark in front of him. Didn't always look at it, but he had it in front of him. And I was working on that. And it was very validating to realize, I asked myself recently, would I ever invest in finishing my PhD? And I realized that I wouldn't, because ministry is so much more urgent. Like, I feel such a greater urgency to caring for people. I mean, the history of the Bible is way cool. And I still want to do a children's book on it and things like that. But again, ministry is my true love. And so, again, I'll circle back from a more personal perspective. But what happened was I came to Utah from North Carolina. UNC Chapel Hill is where I did my PhD program, took a lot of classes at Duke University. And after my first divorce, I came back to Utah and I started teaching world religions. And teaching world religions is what changed everything for me. And it gave me a really big picture of how to engage with religion. And I taught world religions again and again and again. And students semester after semester would say, you know, Professor Anderson, I don't know how I feel about religion, but tell me more. Tell me more about your approach to religion. And so this is kind of like a big picture teaser. My approach to religion is social science and systems theory informed, which basically means, how do we experience religion as human beings? And one way that I minister to everyone is I make the point that religion is more about being human than about the nature of God, paradoxically, you know, and bringing those together, meaning is found in the spaces between. So bringing those together, religion is about our relationship with God. And that may seem obvious. So I'm almost to the point where I can get around to my own story. So in 2013, I was teaching a course on the future of religion. And I had several very clear intuitions, inspiration, revelation, whatever you want to call it. And one is that my path was ministry, you know, that I could do more good helping people with their relationship to religion than teaching religion. And so I founded my nonprofit, the Olam Institute. And the tagline for that is heal the world through religion done better. This is my passion is well-being. And my agenda, you and I have joked about what my agenda is. My agenda is to help everyone maximize their well-being, help everyone be as well as possible. And that's going to mean different things to different people, depending on a lot of factors. And so I taught world religions for a few more years. I had another divorce, and that is what led me to my dark night of the soul and kind of broke everything down personally for me. And it was after that I found a job as a chaplain. And I started in 2013, when I felt my call to ministry. I had a very clear intuition that I should serve the imprisoned and dying. Because my fundamental question, again, that we'll come back to, is there a way to live so well that it doesn't matter what's true? We'll come back to epistemology. But I deeply believe, I'm becoming increasingly convinced, that there is a way to live that is so demonstrably good that we don't need to worry overly much about the details of, as President Hinckley said, you know, do the pearly gates swing inward or outward? And I think that's being too dismissive around theology. You know, theology is, or doctrine, as LDS call it, theology is the nature of reality. You know, like, how do we understand spiritual reality? But President
and theology has no small, you know, no small place in the LDS church either. So that's also one thing to remember.
Yeah. Theology is very interesting in the LDS church because it's hidden. I talked to Terrell and Fiona Givens about what I call guerrilla theology, because we call it doctrine. And it's interesting because theology is to doctrine as the scientific method is to science. So theology both refers to the method and the product of the method. And I think, again, there's so many rich subjects to come back to, but one thing that I would love to see in the LDS church is a more rigorous and transparent engagement with doctrine. There's not, so what faithful members of the church look for is for the general authorities, and especially the apostles and the prophet, to declare revelation and doctrine. You know, that's functionally how it works. And it's been very interesting to see how, I mean, President Nelson has been very bold, and I've been very interested by the way that he presents and talks about doctrine. Even with that, and I've been, as I said, I've been generally impressed by what he's done. There's no real cultural conversation about what is doctrine and how does doctrine update. We have, I mean, I think the 1978 revelation about Blacks in the priesthood, those of African ancestry in the priesthood and access to the temple, is one of the more interesting examples. And I like asking people, how do we know which side of 1978 we're on? You know, like how would one know that? And I do think President, or Elder McConkey's, don't mean to give him a posthumous promotion, Elder McConkey's talk after the 1978 revelation was beautifully humble, especially given his reputation as someone who's very bold. He wrote most of the headings in the scriptures. And he said, forget everything I've ever said about race in the priesthood. I also think that the gospel topic essays are fascinating examples of updating doctrine. But again, these updates are kind of slipped in almost secretly. There's no cultural conversation, or little cultural conversation about, well, what does this mean, and what does it mean that we update? And I wish that were more transparent. I think it would be more healthy.
There is a lot of conversation, but not in the official circles, right? I mean, not from the...
Yes. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons for the change in progress in the LDS Church and religion in general, is that the internet and the popularization and the access we have to each other. I mean, this is amazing that we're having a conversation in Estonia and Utah, right? I mean, that's incredible. And the fact that we can talk to each other is fundamental in where religion is in the current world. Another topic that we can come back to. So finishing up really quick, as far as how I got to what I do, is I got a job at a hospice, which has been life-changing. Sitting with the dying has done more for my character than perhaps anything else. It really puts life in perspective, not surprisingly. And then I got a job at the Utah State Prison, which has been so beautiful, because it's funny, when I applied for the job at the prison, I wasn't expecting to get it. And I didn't remember 4 years ago, earlier than that, when I was like, oh, I should serve in the prison. And the reason why I felt prompted to look at prison and hospice is because incarceration and hospice are two of the areas, military is another, where religious doctrine, theology, myths, whatever we want to call it, where religious beliefs are the most impactful and people put the most weight on them. Like as you are actively dying, your belief in the afterlife is a pretty big deal, although not as much as you'd think. That's a twist. In fact, I just had an interview at a hospital for an on-call position. And the chaplain director said, Jared, if a patient says to you, what do you think just happened? Where do you think my dead child is? Like, can you give me some reassurance that my dead child is okay? And normal human instinct would be to give that reassurance, right? But it's actually not professional ministry best practice, because it's a crutch and it's not about the ministry. This is something that members of the LDS Church can learn to their benefit, because one thing, to make it personal, one thing that has been difficult for me, and I've been doing this for coming on 4 years, so I have a lot of experience, but one thing that was difficult for me as a minister or a chaplain is, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I have been conditioned, we are conditioned to teach people the truth and give them all the answers. And there's a tremendous amount, and an unethical amount, to be very direct, of presumptuousness, where it's built right into the missionary culture that, knock, knock, I have all the answers about how you should live. And let me tell you how to live your life down to all of the details. And I don't think you were in the Engaging Gospel Doctrine group yet when maybe you were, when a missionary joined the group and he's like, if anyone has any questions about life, just let me know. And I gently said, like, obviously I know exactly where that's coming from. I mean, I did the same thing at 19. I said, most of the people in this group, this is a scripture study group. Oh, I should have stated earlier that Kenna and I know each other from the Engaging Gospel Doctrine podcast that I've been doing for 8 years, which is a productive approach to Sunday school and scripture study, and by extension, also a whole discussion about the gospel and living life. We can come back to that, but I just gently said to this missionary, just a reminder that most people in this group have had much more life experience than you have, and you are welcome to join the conversation, but I hope that you'll do so in kind of a humble, open way. And again, that's one of the that's definitely on my wish list of things that could be improved. And so the unexpected truth of effective ministry, and my favorite thing about ministry, is you show up where life breaks open. Chaplains are often about trauma management. People are in a state of panic or concern or grief, or they're dealing with the big questions of human experience. And here's the secret, though, and this is not easy for someone raised LDS, is it's about facilitating your experience. It's nothing to do with my beliefs and my journey. And in fact, a playful way of putting it is a really vital way of ministering, or a training that you need as a minister, is deal with your own stuff so you don't get it on other people. In therapy, they call this transference and countertransference, where, for example, if you are going through a divorce, for example, that's something that I have a hard time with because I've gone through it. And so anyway, it's my stuff, not your stuff. And so that was a long way to kind of talk about ministry. And I loved teaching religion, and it's nothing like being a minister. I'm so happy here.
So good. And thank you for starting out with such a let's say extensive introduction that then we got a good idea of where you come. And just maybe let's give people a few more facts. You mentioned you've had 2 divorces, but you're right now how old? 40 something?
43.
43. So I'll be turning 43 soon. So we're about the same age. And then and I also forgot to mention that so for me this podcast is, like I said, it's basically my own journey and letting others come along. I have no intention to make money from this podcast. I do it so seldom that and I have another full-time professional job that I do, and my approach to this is to be just open about the topics and open with people's faith journeys, and just kind of learn from their experience and learn from their their views, whatever they have.
I'd be happy to go into that now that we know how I got to be a chaplain. Does that sound good?
It sounds good. Yeah, let's go into it, and let's start from the beginning. I mean, from the introduction, we now know that you are LDS. You have served the mission. I think it came up a little bit that you know what a 19-year-old missionary feels like, and what he believes. But let's start from the beginning. Let's start with
I will start at the beginning. So on my father's side, that's such an American LDS thing to do, is to give your pedigree, but it's part of the story. So on my father's side, converts go all the way back to the beginning. I have a great whatever grandfather who received his patriarchal blessing by Hiram Smith, ancestors across the plains, all of that. And so my father's side of the family is mostly from Utah, and my mother's parents converted to the church. In fact, my mother and father met on his mission, and I grew up kind of all over. It's going to get a bit complicated, but my first stepfather was a military police officer, and so I was born in the Palmyra stake, actually. So I come from, right where the church began.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the Palmyra stake, and I was born in New York, and then I went to Utah for my stepdad's ROTC. Then we went back to New York. Then we went to Germany for 3 years. Then we went to Alabama for 6 months. Then we went to Georgia, not the country, the state, for 3 years. Then my mom finally left my stepdad because he was abusive, and we went back to New York. So I did like high school in New York. So I was born in New York and grew up active LDS and just loved it. Like I really, I remember like so many good memories of singing the primary songs and thinking that I was so clever when we sang, the wise man, the foolish man. And I thought it was funny to be like, the rains went up and the floods went down, because that just being clever. I remember one of my favorite memories is I was looking in the scriptures at like 8 or 9 years old, and I got baptized at 8 in Germany. And I was looking at the footnotes because even then I was a nerd, and I noticed the Heb and Ger footnotes. And I didn't know that stood for Hebrew and Greek, but it's a really fun foreshadowing. So I've always been a very, very systematic thinker. And through my undergraduate, I was a very thoughtful, systematic, curious student of the church. And so, for example, as I read the Book of Mormon, I would pay attention to the path of transmission, you know, and I would notice that it always goes from father to brother, like to brother, or to like then to son, then to brother, son. Like that's always the pattern. And so we can use that to extrapolate and find out that Nephi was Alma the younger's brother. Like it's not stated in the text. So even this is an important detail. Ever since I was a child, I have thought like a theologian and a philosopher. And that's how I coped, actually. For example, I knew that my abusive stepfather was sealed to my mother. And so at 7 or 8 years old, I had to ask myself the question, would I want to be in heaven with my abusive stepfather? And I asked myself questions like this as a small child.
Jared, just for people to know the context a little bit better, when you say abusive, that can mean a million things. Just maybe really briefly, would you be comfortable saying what it meant and what?
Yeah, it was mostly emotional and physical abuse. So lots of threats. He told us he would kill us in our sleep with a hollow-tipped bullet, hitting, beating with a belt, you know, things like that.
But while he was an active LDS member, or was he active or not?
He was active LDS. In fact, my first memory is being handcuffed to my crib. And I'm actually surprised that I don't have more religious trauma. Like I'm very impressed that religion was a refuge for me, not trauma, because his name is Fred. He had a very strange relationship to religion. So he would abuse us, but he also was very meticulous around religion. So he handcuffed me and my brother together by our ankles for more than a day because my brother wasn't watching me well enough. And then he unhandcuffed us to go to church. Or, you know, like while being actively abusive, we had family home evening and scripture study quite faithfully. And he would critique us for not being reverent enough at church. But it's congruent because I don't know whether there's a technical term, scrupulosity, you know, where you're kind of obsessive
about religious things.
Yeah, and I think he has an element of that, and I think that's partially where his abusiveness came from. So we would have like military room inspections, you know, where he'd like dump out it was almost like being in boot camp. And so that's interesting. Or he would like, when we would like clean up the house, he would pick up everything on the floor and stuff it in my mouth once because it wasn't clean enough. And so it's not surprising that he wanted us to be like very faithful religious, because he had that anxiety, and I think that's where his abusiveness came from as well. And that's me.
Can I ask a quick question about one thing? So did his let's say his behavior and the way you know what he represented to you, did it have, in your opinion, any effect on how you thought about your heavenly Father?
That's an excellent question. And as I mentioned, social science and systems theory are my main lens for understanding human behavior. And I love ministry because ministry is all about the vulnerable, authentic, lived experience of it. Absolutely. I mean, yes and no. Because intellectually, and I think on a soul level to some degree, the answer is yes and no, obviously. I mean, the answer is kind of always yes and no. On one hand, Heavenly Father was my refuge. and I think this is one of the very best outcomes of religion, is that, I mean, religion saves lives. Religion leads to suicide sometimes, but it also saves lives. And for me, it worked that way, where for me, the idea of a heavenly Father and a loving, I didn't know my father. We haven't gotten to that point. Like my father was bipolar, schizoaffective, got into drugs at 14 years old. He was in juvenile detention of some sort most of his high school. He was brilliant. He studied Hebrew and Latin, and like I met him when I was 16. I only have one other memory of my father, and I was sitting on his lap at 4 years old, and I asked him when he was going to stop smoking. Good little missionary even at 4. And that's awkward phone calls on birthdays. That's basically the only access I had. So my father was Kim, and Fred, this abuser, was Dad. And having an absent father and then an abusive stepfather sounds like a bad Disney movie. So for me, as I said, religion, even though it was used abusively by my stepdad, for me, religion was always a positive. And as I said, I'm impressed by that. I really, because it doesn't need to go that way. It could have been a traumatic response as well. But for me, religion was my refuge. And there are deep, if you know anything about like attachment theory and trauma response in general, like my abuse has definitely impacted my ability to trust and things like that. But if we're just talking about understanding of God and spiritual reality, it was my refuge. Like I loved reading the scriptures. I loved going to church. I have written in my journal since I was 8 years old. I would faithfully pray. And so I guess my answer is more no than yes. Like I definitely have issues relating to my abuse, but my perception of Heavenly Father was always that there was someone loving. I think a combination of LDS culture and the abuse led to me being quite self-sufficient. You know, like this idea that I need to do everything on my own, which is pretty LDS perfectionism. But what I was going to say, and then I'll listen for any follow-up questions, is when I was very young, I came to the conclusion, again, I've always been a very systematic thinker. So I said, okay, this is how it's going to work, like an equation. If my stepdad is not worthy of heaven, I don't need to worry about being with him. If my stepfather is in heaven with me, I don't need to worry about him because he will be worthy of heaven. And then I also, one of the few times I challenged him is, this is all in Germany. You know, that's kind of when everything came to a head. I was 7, 8, 9. And I said, Dad, I don't think children should do what their parents ask because they fear them. I think they should do what their parents ask because they love them. So that's a quite sophisticated, creative, courageous engagement. You know,
how old were you when you said that?
Like 8. And he's the one who baptized me. Like I remember quite vividly that experience. And then his answer was, I do whatever I have to. So he kind of shut me down. But through my entire life, and it's not coincidental that I basically lived in my own world growing up. I loved fantasy books. And so, and I mean this neutrally, like not negatively. The LDS worldview was my fantasy and my escape. I mean, it was very, very real to me. Like as I said, I believed every word of it. In fact, do you want to follow up anything before I move on?
I will just comment that. Let me just comment on your stepdad a little bit, because so this is something that I have noticed within myself too. I'm also a very much or have been in the past, I was a convert to the church. It meant a great deal for me to go from a non-believer to a believer. And then I've always been a very, I would say I've always been like a perfectionist. I always very meticulous. I always want to get the best possible result, and very competitive, very ambitious. And so I started to live, the LDS religion also very meticulously. I think it's not full on like scrupulosity. I wouldn't say, but very meticulous. And so when you're in the culture, and I've had many leadership positions, local leadership positions, and you always want to be the example and be the best, and you want your children also to take it seriously and do their best, and so I have also been, I would not say really abusive, but a very strict dad, let's put it this way. And then through various experiences in my life, I have seen that this LDS worldview, in my case at least, affected, the way I was a parent and the way I looked or approached or viewed my children, and things I was doing and they were doing. And so I was also often got very mad about when they were not taking, doing church things seriously. But then obviously I've had my, little faith transitions, and one of the things that was a great, let's say, what's that word in English? That has led me to my transition is the understanding that everyone is an individual being, my children being, among them, and that I cannot force or manipulate them to do church things, and it's, if I'm being a very strict father with them, and that way trying to discipline them or take church or religion seriously, then that's not really the way it's supposed to be. That's not, God's plan, to put it this way. I think that I have to respect their freedom to choose. I have to look at them as, children of God, individual beings, and be very mild and, courteous and kind and respectful when I direct them, when I want them to do, certain things. And I've done a lot of reassessment of the, what matters, what doesn't matter. So I would just say that like my approach is that, or the way I view is that the LDS Church has many tremendous and wonderful things about it. The list is very long of the positive things that the LDS Church has. But then there are also some things that are not so good, and that are, let's say, fundamentally not good. And when you're in the system, you don't understand how this could affect you in a negative way, until you, let's say, you you come across some experience in life where you see that, okay, this approach just does not work. In my instance, it does not work, whether it's something that the church promotes or whatever believes is the right way to do it. Then I think that a lot of these negative things are actually cultural. They're ingrained in the church, but they're no way part of like the doctrine, or shouldn't be. That's the whole different story. How I feel that what we should approach as doctrine and whatnot. But I think that we have to be very open to understanding that there are certain embedded fundamental negative things which does not have to have any influence over, you know, whether we choose to be members or attend regularly or even believe that it's true, but that when we discover them, then we should, you know, be able to react appropriately and change, you know, our views basically in order to be able to behave differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think a more appropriate word than cultural, because I feel like cultural is a squirrely word that can excuse things, is institutional. And one
Yes.
of the, again, we can come back to this, but I, like, one thing that hurts my heart is I deeply believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints could be one of the best religions on the planet. Like, even with all of its issues, I think it is one of the most powerful religions on the planet. And I'm fascinated by motivation. I'm fascinated by well-being. And I think that the LDS Church could be so much healthier than it is. Again, we can come back to this, because I think, for example, the LDS Church has a lot to learn from Catholicism, where Catholicism, or even Episcopalianism, I love even more than Catholicism, but Catholicism with its truth and authority claims is a more useful comparison. Catholicism has very, very strong, you know, claims and requirements and expectations, and yet largely in part of it, because it's so big and so old and so powerful, there's also a graciousness to it, you know, where it's like, I mean, well, yeah, sure, you're Catholic, like you're Catholic, you get to be Catholic even if you don't, you know, come except
on. Well, they don't have the tempo recommend interviews. That's a big difference, but that's another topic.
Right. So, like, one thing, just again to kind of put a pin in, is one of the complicated things about the LDS Church is that the theology and the institutional approaches, and therefore the sociology that comes from the institutional approaches, doesn't really line up, or it lines up incredibly selectively, which is always the case. And I'll say something very direct, and then I'll get back to my story. I think that the best way to be healthy as a member of the LDS Church is to be at tension with the current institutional practices. And that's really unfortunate. You know, I think that the church should do better. I want our institutions to facilitate the best outcomes. You know, I think about it like bringing a sack lunch to a buffet restaurant. Not that those exist anymore, but like, you shouldn't need to bring your own lunch to a restaurant. The point of going to a restaurant is to be fed. And I feel like the LDS Church is very similar to that, where, now this is the motivation of my Sunday school podcast. I strongly believe that if you know, I'll call it Mormonism, LDS Christianity, whatever you want to call it. Like, if you know LDS Christianity well enough, you can live a really good, healthy life. But it's not what the institution is emphasizing. And I think one of the single biggest problems at a deep institutional level, a system level, is that the current LDS Church sets temple attending member as the only valid way to live. And that makes it cult strength, just to put aside for a moment. And because temple attending member of the church is the only valid way to live, everything else is a project.
Exactly.
And I say that without any, I mean, we can have really interesting conversations around, is temple recommend holding member a good way to live? For some, in general, you know, like my take on religion is that most people are better human beings with religion than without religion. But we could talk about stages of faith and things like that. But at the same time, it has those limits.
Yeah, I was going to say that this doesn't have anything to do with the, you know, with the temple ceremonies themselves or the ritual themselves, but just that the fact that certain you know, qualifications have been placed, and those qualifications represent a certain approach, and the way, you know, the narrative is that yes, like you said, that this is the only valid way to live, and not only that the principles are good, or, you know, should be lived, but also the how should I say, the practical application is predetermined of how you live.
And it holds your family and your income hostage, and that's not really ethical. You know, to say you won't be with your family unless you go to the temple. When I was a kid, I'm like, what stops you from hanging out with your family? And I love that the temple teaches that this is the celestial kingdom, which blows things open. But and then, of course, this idea that, like, unless you pay your tithing, you can't go to the temple. And functionally, that's paying for salvation. Whether or not tithing, like, so one thing that has really, really helped me in my own journey and approach to religion is I look at how things function. Like, how are things working? Because that really clarifies things for me. It's a little bit like there's something called the intention fallacy, where we don't know what people's intentions are. We mostly don't know what our own intentions are. And so arguing with your loved one about intentions is not very productive, you know, whereas a therapist will tell you it's a healthy way to communicate. When you do this, I feel this way. Or when you spend your money on this, we don't have enough money for this. Like just really clear, like, these are the demonstrable outcomes of this. And I deeply believe that there is a way to live every religion that is so demonstrably good that, again, truth claims don't matter. And in fact, that is my current approach to religion, is to live in such a way that the way that you live is so good and so demonstrably good that you don't need to rely on any particular truth claim panning out. Whereas the current LDS church puts all of its weight, you know, where they're like, you need to be a member of the church so that you can get to heaven, you know, like, so you can get the temple ordinances that will get you to heaven. Whereas I think a much healthier way, like a win-win that can't lose, would be something like living an LDS life will, through covenants, through community, help you become the best, most Christ-like version of yourself. And the temple ordinances will help you. Like, one thing I discussed on the podcast is it covenants or ordinances that save you? And the difference really, really matters. Can I get back to my story, or do you want to say something first?
No, I was going to say that I'm going to push your idea even a little further. The way I think about it these days is that, you know, the optimal approach to life and, you know, the way you live should not even depend on the afterlife, whether there even is afterlife. Because
this is also the basis of my ministry. So I did a presentation at a statewide hospice conference, and it was called Bereavement Without Belief. And another thing we can come back to is I have a lot of religious experience, as I'll get to in a moment, but I deeply believe that it's all about the human experience. And I agree with you. The way that I summarize it, I love summaries, is the afterlife can be hoped for, but should not be gambled on. And I've been, you'll like this because you're a finance guy. I've been thinking about, if we are investing based on hope, we are going into debt. Because, or I think gamble is a better metaphor than debt. Because, and this is Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is a terrible idea. But it's a gamble because, and it's like, I am spending all this money, or resources is a better term. I am investing all these resources in the hopes that I'm going to get this promised reward. Whereas I think instead of this gamble, I don't want the gamble metaphor, which again, functionally is how the LDS Church currently works. I want an investment metaphor, which is your investment in religion will have real and immediate benefits in this life. And there are, like, one of my very favorite quotes is when President Hinckley was setting up the Perpetual Education Fund. And I think he quoted Joseph F. Smith, where he says, a religion that does not help someone in this life is not likely to be much use in the next. And so I don't, like, for example, in my hospice work, I never push back against afterlife belief. I mean, I try to go deeper and explore the grief response, but I definitely agree with that. And even when I would teach in church, I would say, hypothetically speaking, you know, just as a thought exercise, if you came to the sure knowledge that your consciousness ended at death, would you live your life differently? I think that's one of the most important questions. And I think that whether you're active, whether you're not active, whatever your approach to religion is, you can answer that question no, which is healthy. I really believe that you can live in such a way that no matter what your beliefs are, you can say it's worth it. Like it is worth it here and now. And that's one of my biggest ethical tests in my life right now. Is, I mean, I joke that I want that to be my epitaph, is worth it, because I'm intense and I just want everything to be worth it. And so I completely agree with you. So I, very active as a teenager. I loved singing. I loved going to the Sacred Grove. I loved watching the Hill Cumorah pageant. I would listen to church music all the time. I would listen to, in fact, my stepdad number 2, who was a waste of human tissue. He died alone in his trailer. Good riddance. But he was like, Jared, stop reading the Book of Mormon and go get a job. You know, like that was how I wanted to like read I read from 3rd Nephi to the rest of the, you know, to the end of the Book of Mormon in one sitting. And then I loved blessing the sacrament. I took it really seriously. And then I went to BYU and just...
And that was before your mission, right?
Yeah, I went to 1 year at BYU before my mission. Mm-hmm. And loved it, was very immature and zealous, you know, naive. And because there were only 3 members of the church at my high school. And so I went to BYU because I wanted that Utah Zion experience. And that went pretty well, you know. And then I went home and worked for an assembly line for a couple months. And then I went to my mission to Madagascar and Reunion. I never went to Mauritius, but it was originally part of the South Africa Durban mission, French speaking, but it was the Mascarene Islands. So it was Madagascar and the Mascarene Islands, which is Reunion, which is like the Hawaii of France. And then Mauritius, which is independent now, but I think it was affiliated with India. At some point, even now, it's quite Indian in its culture. So very, very zealous missionary. I would say that I had a degree of scrupulosity on my mission, because I think that intense circumstances bring out intense personalities. And so I went vegan, no sugar, based on reading the Word of Wisdom, which is a terrible idea, on a mission. I would wake up at like 5 a.m. and pray for an hour. You know, and those were reasonably good experiences for me personally from a faith perspective, but not very integrated or healthy. I was Pharisaic, if I can say that, because the Pharisees get a bad name in the New Testament, but the actual beliefs and the way that the Pharisees lived was admirable, which is if you live the law carefully enough, you can be as holy as a priest. And the priests were the holiest, whereas the actual priests who ran the temple were like, if you're not part of the priestly line, no luck. You know, like it's just us. So Pharisees were actually a very popular, powerful approach. And one reason why Jesus argued with them so much is because Jesus was quite similar. You know, he was like a cousin to the Pharisees, kind of, and Paul was a Pharisee. So I was overly anxious on my mission for sure. I met my first wife on my mission, funny enough, like my dad did. And we can follow up on this if you want, but this was very difficult for me. I don't feel like I was able to consent to my marriage or children because as a devout member of the church, there was nothing else that I could imagine. So I moved in with my outlaws, my ex-in-laws, within 3 weeks of getting home from my mission. I was married within 3 months of coming home from my mission. And I had my first baby by the time the missionary I trained came home. You know, I mean, it all happened very, very fast. And ethics are all about context and alternatives. And so if you can't imagine saying no, then your yes doesn't really matter. Like the reason that we have legal documents is because it's like, do you agree to this thing that you're doing? Assuming, and if it's coerced, it doesn't count. You know, if there's a gun to my head and it's like, sign this or die, like that's not legally binding. And I feel like they're called high cost religions. I feel like that's how it functions. And so I have had to spend a lot of time and effort making peace with my decision. I mean, it wasn't even really a decision. I just did it. So I got married. I never even proposed to my first wife. She just said, if we're going to get married, we should do it before my sister leaves on her mission. And Elder Holland sealed us in the Salt Lake Temple, which was a cool experience. But again, it wasn't a decision that I made. And that ended up being a very, very bad marriage. And we Mormoned so hard. We went to the temple every month. We really, really leaned in as hard as we could with, like, we're taught that being an active member of the church will solve your problems. And this is an area where the church has gotten better. I'm very grateful that, and we did counseling with the referral of the church, and the church even helped pay for it. And I think that's healthy where it happens. I think that the church is doing much better now than it used to, telling bishops, give advice and help where you can, and then send them to therapy. I don't know what kind of resources there are in Estonia, but in the United States, it's gotten better, where they do send you to therapy rather than trying to solve all of your problems.
I think that probably depends on the local leader a lot, but I mean, I would guess it works the same way here too. I don't think they have any fear of secular therapy or anything. So
they have some. It's interesting. I think the LDS Church is at its healthiest when it is mixed with other cultures. I think that's where you get the best high quality Mormonism, where it's diluted and mixed in with other cultures. I think that's where you get the most robust Mormonism, not Utah, where sometimes I grew up hearing Utah Mormonism is not real Mormonism. And Utah Mormonism is what Mormonism becomes when it can, when it has that full,
right. Mm-hmm.
full power. So I graduated from the University of Utah, like my father did, interestingly. He and I had the same Hebrew teacher, which gave me all sorts of dad issues. And so academia was my refuge. And the church was still my refuge. Like, interestingly enough, even though my marriage was really, really hard, I still loved being active in the church. Like, it was really a resource for me. So we had 3 children in that marriage, and I got into grad school at UNC Chapel Hill. I wrote my honors thesis on Joseph Smith, his study of languages. I based my PhD program on 1 Nephi 13. Like, the idea of the great and abominable church editing the Bible led me to enter a PhD program in the history of the Bible. And I even, this is embarrassing, but informative, I wrote Christopher Tuckett, who's one of the top textual critics in the entire world. I wrote him about hidden manuscripts, because that's what, like, if there were going to be hidden manuscripts, where would they be? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I share that as an illustration of how earnestly I believed in the LDS Church. Historically, it's called the Criterion of Dissimilarity, or even the Criterion of Embarrassment. And I did. Like, I did embarrass myself. Like, you can know that something is sincere if it's against your own self-interest, and also if you invest in it. So I believed in the LDS Church and theology so much that I embarrassed myself, and I based my entire PhD program on it.
Jared, I have a quick question about something that I think we kind of, I forgot to ask earlier. I think that, let's say, Orthodox members who are listening to our conversation, they will have a question about, okay, I see, that Jared has had some kind of a faith transition, but did you ever really believe, and did you ever really have spiritual experiences to confirm to you that this is in fact the one and only true church? Do you want to share some of those experiences from your youth?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I value the way. The best way, I value the way you asked that. The best way that I can answer your question is I had dramatic spiritual experiences, and I assumed the one true church. See, because my spiritual experiences have been more based in a relationship with God. And I think this is one reason why my spirituality has been so healthy. And I can honestly say that I never had a faith crisis, and we're getting to that chapter in just a moment, even though my faith has shifted quite significantly, because I feel like my anchor and my foundation, I always had this intuition that spirituality is about your own connection with greater reality, you know, or God. So I would follow Moroni's promise every single time that I read the Book of Mormon. You know, I've read the Book of Mormon, I don't know, maybe 20 times. And more significantly with the podcast, I have invested hundreds of hours in carefully analyzing the Bible. I mean, with my podcast, I have functionally written commentary for all of the LDS scriptures. And I like that you asked that question, because I come across as quite intellectual, because that's the banter that we're having right now. But at my core, I'm actually a mystic. And I am most passionate about the lived sacred experience of relationship. And so to answer your question, I absolutely had spiritual experiences that I interpreted as confirming that the church was the one true church, because that's what I was taught. But of course, the answers you get depend on the questions that you're asking. And so I felt the Holy Ghost. I was very earnest and concerned about worthiness. I loved my experience going through the temple. I went to the Toronto temple when I received my endowments.
That's where I served my mission.
Oh, wonderful.
Into that temple a couple of
Yeah.
times.
So the Palmyra temple was not built yet, and the Washington, D.C. temple was the closest one before Toronto was built. And I had a very, very good experience going through the temple. And so that sacred experience going through the temple was another layer of confirmation. Again, I like focusing on function. And so I grew up feeling spiritual experiences in the context of the LDS Church, including and I know we're talking kind of academically, but I think it's a bridge between subjective experience and objective truth. And then there's intersubjective story, which is the cultural stories that we tell. And so even all the times that I went to the temple, I haven't been since 2014. We'll get to that. I haven't been active since 2013 as a bit of a preview. But I hope listeners can tell that I have tremendous reverence for the LDS Church. And I have tremendous reverence for religion and spirituality in general. So I am in no way a skeptic. I'm a critical thinker, and I'm a very systematic critical thinker, but I don't lean toward dismissiveness or like a hyper materialism or whatever. You know, I don't have much respect for that. So through my entire journey, I have maintained I'm dedicating my entire life to religion, right? Like that shows how important it is to me. So the first big shift in my faith was when I went to graduate school. So I went to graduate school to study religion, and instantly, like first semester, I was like, whoa, everything that I learned was wrong. Not in the sense of the church is not true, but in the sense of, wow, the way that we talk about religion is wrong and not helpful. So interestingly, I attended a seminar at Brigham Young University after my first year of grad school. And that was super interesting because at BYU, I had PhDs in religion tell me not to do a PhD in religion, because there was this narrative that I think is irresponsible, which is, we have authority, we have the Spirit, therefore we don't need methodology, we don't need, and I think this is one of the blind spots of the LDS Church, is like, one thing that members don't understand is that, so I'm currently working on what's called a Master of Divinity, which is like the coolest name for a degree ever.
Yes.
It sounds like a role-playing title, but a Master of Divinity is every bit as rigorous as a Master of Social Work or a Master of Counseling. It is not academic, it's professional. Like, it is a 90-hour master's degree that is then followed up by 2,000 hours of supervised training. So basically, a minister is as trained as a therapist or a social worker. Whereas in the LDS Church, we're taught that if you have the Spirit and if you have authority, that is equal to all of this professional training. And I think that's very irresponsible. But I wasn't yet in pastoral training. I was only in academic training. So my PhD was trained in history. It was not theology, because theology is like the coherence of the stories about spiritual reality. I was trained in the academic study of religion, specifically the academic study of the Bible. And we can come back around to that. So I've studied 12 languages. In fact, like, most of those are books about the Bible and languages. I've read the Bible in the original Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. I've studied Syriac, Coptic, Latin, Farsi on a government grant, which was funny. And so as soon as I started studying the methodology of how you study religion, I was like, whoa, this is not what I was taught. And the way that I grew up was, don't listen to the man behind the curtain, to allude to the Wizard of Oz. It was that scholars of religion are wrong because they don't have authority, they don't have the Spirit, and at its worst, they are deceived by Satan, right? That's the basic idea. And one interesting and disturbing thing about LDS culture is that we are encouraged to professionalize, but not be educated necessarily. We aren't really trained in critical thinking. We are trained at professional success, which is super useful, but also has its own problems.
The other quick note that just kind of that I've always found kind of let's put it this way, interesting, is that LDS Church, we're not Amish. We are taking advantage of every possible benefit that science has brought to the world. The only place we don't apply it is in religion. So that's another thing notice.
That's a fascinating and troubling insight. And pretty much the humanities in general, we're a bit iffy on, where it's like, maybe don't study philosophy. So we are really rigorous, as I said, around professionalization. We're encouraged to be doctors, lawyers, dentists. So many dentists, like MBAs, finance, and we've kind of become super capitalists, interestingly, to our benefit. It's interesting with the church's investments, right? Like, however you argue ethically, the LDS Church is very, very successful. And you can't criticize it for not being successful. Like, it's amazing. So through my graduate degree, I basically rewrote Mormonism. And that has been, so I believed in the fundamentals of Mormonism through my comprehensive exams. So in like my first year of graduate school, I went into the questions of epistemology, which is the philosophical and theological question of how do we know what we know? And I immediately went there, and it wasn't troubling to me because I was like, oh, right, of course, Joseph Smith would receive revelation the way that he understood reality to be, not the way it actually is. So the way that I would summarize, and that didn't trouble me, so basically we receive revelation not the way God is, we receive revelation the way we are. And in fact, I participated in this wonderful, if troubling, series of conferences called Faith and Knowledge. And I say troubling because it was a little bit disingenuous about what the funders wanted versus the way it was presented to the participants. The people backing the conference were trying to nurture apologists, and it was presented to us. It was for graduate students in religion. And it was presented to us as kind of like a support conference, you know, networking, talking about constructive approaches to religion, which I'm obsessed with. Like, constructive approaches to religion is like, that's what I do. So in 2007, I presented a paper on revelation according to our language, where I argued that the Book of Mormon was historical, but I argued it in such a way where I said, if the Book of Mormon is not historical, everything else goes, like even the atonement, because there's this coherence. And then 2 years later, I presented a paper called Revelation According to Our Expectations, where I was going deeper into philosophy. And I was saying, okay, not only does our language and context, situatedness, as Heidegger called it, not only does that impact the way that we receive revelation, but our expectations impact the way we receive revelation. So for example, if you pray and say, should I get divorced? If you cannot fathom the idea of getting divorced, I don't think you're going to get the right answer. Funny enough, I did. The most dramatic spiritual experience, one of them, I have a handful that are really, really anchors for me. I was praying at the end of my first divorce and just begging God to change me, to fix me, and basically I was praying, I know there'll be curiosity, I was praying for the endurance to remain in an emotionally abusive marriage without intimacy. And you shouldn't. But I wanted to, because I was such a believer in marriage that I was going to stay in that marriage no matter how bad it was. And I heard the voice of God. I heard it, I felt it, it was vibrational, it was inside, outside, which makes you think of the Book of Mormon where it's like thunder, like super interesting. And the voice said, Jared, who are you to say that in order for your children to be what they need to be and do what they need to do, they don't need to come from a broken home? And that shut me up. So that was interesting because that was a dramatic spiritual experience against my interests, my request, my assumptions. So that was super dramatic and interesting.
This was your Nephi experience when he cut off the head of Laban, right?
I mean, I personally think Nephi was lying about that, but
Well, I mean, as an archetype, you know, like
I don't like that. I don't like that archetype because I think it's unethical. I think it's profoundly unethical. I think Nephi panicked killed Laban
And then justified himself.
and then justified it later. This was my Paul experience. I really like Paul on the road to Damascus, where he got the answer that he wasn't expecting. He got the answer opposite to the one that he was asking for. Well, actually, he wasn't even asking for, or Alma the Younger.
But can I push back a little bit? What I think makes it similar to Nephi's experience, whether it actually happened or not, is that we are used to talking about, and this is what Jesus sort of taught, was that the norm is that divorce is not the answer, right? But then,
right.
as we have our own unique circumstances in life, we are seeking for our own unique answer. We have to be willing to receive, or sometimes we do receive, the answer that is, let's say, not the norm, but it is the true way for us in this circumstance.
It's the right one, and I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. So the one thread that has gone through my entire life is spirituality has always been a core resource for accessing my best self, and even better than my better self, and I'm really grateful for that. And I think that is one of the most precious gifts of religion. It's transcendent, right? Like it pulls us beyond what we can even imagine. So to kind of get through the rest of my faith journey in the broad strokes is I got divorced. I got remarried. I was still in North Carolina. My first wife moved our children out to Utah. I was in North Carolina, so we were thousands of miles apart. I saw them as much as I could, but I lived 3 years without being with my children, which was so hard, so hard. And so I did my comprehensive exams. And at the time of my comprehensive exams, I still believed in the celestial kingdom. I still believed in Joseph Smith. I still believed in the prophet. I still believed that the LDS church was true and maybe the best religion. I still believed in the temple ordinances, but just very creatively, where I'm like, who knows what the reality is? Is God an interdimensional portal? Why do we think God looks like us? Why would God look like a human at this particular stage in our evolution? I'm like, wouldn't it be more like, I love the quote, "We are gods in embryo." And I'm like, so does God look like us as much as we look like our embryos? I don't know. But I still believed, and that's what I mean by I've always thought a philosopher and theologian is I would just go down the rabbit hole and ask all of these questions. Does God have a belly button? I don't think so, because it's a scar. Anyway, interesting things. And so I believed in creative theology, but still very based in the LDS truth claims. And so I finally was able to come out to Utah, and I moved out to Utah as soon as I could to be with my kids. And I started teaching world religions. And when I started teaching world religions is when the whole game changed for me.
And can I just quickly, before you go into that, I can just say that I can identify with that, because for me, the whole game changed when I started to study world religions, and but you actually studied and taught, right?
So I taught world religions for 7 years, and that is what just fundamentally changed me in the best way, because I have always engaged with life as a puzzle, which won't surprise you, right? If you know Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTJ, an Enneagram, which is the mastermind architect. And in the Enneagram, I'm a 1-wing 2, which is the reformer. I want to change things, I want to fix things, but I'm also a healer. So I basically put the puzzle together, then I heal it. And I wasn't at the heal it, I was just puzzle at that point. And world religions gave me the whole puzzle. And for the first time, I could see that the LDS truth claims were precisely what humans would say if they wanted your money. And I don't mean that overly cynical, but I realized that from a historical, because I studied the Bible, but I didn't study Christianity in grad school. I just studied the Bible, and you would, like, listeners, you would be shocked by how particular you get in graduate school. I mean, just because you study one thing doesn't mean you study the thing right next to it. And so I never had studied the history of Christianity. And so I didn't know that historically, Mormonism, and I mean Mormonism broadly, bigger than the LDS Church, Mormonism is what is called restorationist, primitivist Christianity. So there's Catholicism, which has its own history. Then there's like the Eastern Orthodox. There is Syriac Christianity, Coptic Christianity, Armenian Christianity. So there are these like super, super old Christianities. And then the most globally familiar are, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, then the Eastern Orthodox Church, and so forth. You're closer to that than I am. And then the Protestant Reformation was basically like the Catholic Church is corrupt. It doesn't represent what was in the Bible. Sola Scriptura, because everyone talked Latin back then, was the rallying cry. It was like, let's get the scriptures to the people. And restorationist Christianity is like super Protestantism. And so Protestantism is, let's bring the Bible to the people in their own language so that people can have a personal relationship with Christ and they can be saved through their personal relationship with Christ. And then restorationist Christianity in the early 1800s was something like, even the Protestants got it wrong. It's a little bit like a mixture of Catholicism and Protestantism, because it's taking the Protestant argument, which is the Bible has the answer to what's true. And then they're like, but not really, because Jesus established a church that was then lost. And then we are restoring the truthiest, like the most true Christianity that was lost. And so, for example,
Jared, before you go in there, let's just.
I'm about done. I'm not going to. But.
No, actually, please do. But I was going to name that. So when we talk about Protestantism, we're talking about, Lutheran, we're talking about Baptist, we're talking about Methodist, so forth. But then
Presbyterianism, Pentecostalism.
Yeah, sure. But Pentecostal, would you consider Pentecostal the restorationist or just pure Protestantism? Probably Protestantism, yeah. Pentecostal.
It's a little bit. It's a little bit there. It's a charismatic Christianity. So the
restorationist would be then LDS, Jehovah's Witness. Would you
Seventh-day
say
Adventists?
Seventh-day Adventists
are the other.
Those are the major ones, right?
Yeah, those are the big ones. I want to say like Amish and Mennonite are like somewhere in there as well, but like Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and LDS are the big ones. And so it struck me how late and how, I have to admit, presumptuous. And let me be very, very clear that, so in 2009, I became an agnostic. And so I realized that, like, let's say that there's a loving God, which we all want to believe. If there's a loving God, then God will give as much truth as possible to everyone. And the interesting thing about LDS theology is this is taught in LDS theology. Alma 29 is a really great example. Second Nephi 29 also, where it says, like, God speaks to all the nations, gives them revelation according to their language. So it's there, but it's not emphasized as the most important thing. So when I taught world religions, it really struck me that religion is human and religion is powerful. And so I would teach my students, but at the same time, I was very earnest. And I stayed active in the LDS church for 4 years after I stopped believing, because I wanted to be part of the solution. I wanted to improve it from the inside. I valued it. Like I really valued my experience. And that shifts from like epistemology to like pragmatic utilitarianism. And I would bear my testimony saying, you know, by their fruits you shall know them, you know, like check in with the fruits of your membership. I would be productive. I loved teaching Sunday school. And so I was never cynical around religion or even the church. I mean, I genuinely want the LDS church to be its best, healthiest version of itself. I suppose, like, currently my feelings toward the LDS church are like supportively disappointed. And we can get to that, where I really want what's best. You know, I want what's best for everyone. I want everything to be its healthiest version, but I also take very seriously that what is. And so I take the LDS church as an institution very, very seriously. And in my job, especially at the prison and hospice, I interact all the time with LDS members, LDS leaders, and I am nothing but constructive, respectful, and enthusiastic. You know, like I think the LDS church is the reason why volunteerism in Utah is 6 times more than anywhere else in the country.
Sure.
It's really impressive.
I have a quick question for you. So you said you became agnostic. So what do you exactly mean by that? What do you exactly believe about, let's say, God, Jesus, reality, afterlife?
Yeah, and I'm glad you followed up on that, because we use the term, or I mean, I don't know what it is in Estonian, probably similar, but in English we use the word agnostic as like an uncommitted atheist, which is offensive, because atheism and agnosticism are measuring different things. So theism is, do you believe in God or not? Or rather, what are your beliefs around God? And then agnosticism measures certainty. So for example, most atheists are agnostic atheists because they believe in science. So sometimes believers will ask a gotcha question to atheists and be like, if you had proof of God, would you believe in God? And the atheist is like, well, yeah, obviously, because I believe in evidence. You know, they don't have some devotional, I mean, there are anti-theists and militant atheists. What I mean when I playfully call myself a devout agnostic certain theist, and I'll unpack that. And by agnostic, I take very seriously the limitations of human nature. I love social science, and I highly recommend Dan Ariely. He's Israeli, and he has a TED Talk called "Are We in Control of Our Decisions?" I've listened to Yale courses on psychology and the philosophy and science of human nature. And the way that I summarize it, based on my understanding of literal psychology, is perception is hallucination and memory is fiction. So basically, our brains make things up and enough for us to survive. And so we are like literally living in a delusion and a hallucination. But going theologically, we cannot understand anything that is bigger than us, right? So if it's bigger than us, we can't understand it. Because like a 2-dimensional being can never understand 3-dimensional reality. I was talking to my oldest son about 4, 5, they think maybe there are 10 dimensions. And a four-dimensional object is a cubed cube. There's a word for it that I don't remember. Like our brains literally can't understand it.
Yes.
And so that's, and epistemic humility is a term that a big fancy term that I really, really like. By agnostic, I mean that life is a sacred mystery, and I don't know everything. And so for me, it's very, very practical. So intellectually, but I call myself a certain theist, and I do not in any way, shape, I don't claim atheism. I believe in God because I take a functionalist approach to things. So for example, my 5 working models of God are as follows. And this is intellectual, and then I'll get relational in just a moment. God is demonstrably an idea. God is an intersubjective reality, which means so many people believe in God that belief in God changes the world. That's real. Like, that is real. Jesus is real. Allah is real. Buddha is real, because we make them real. Elder Uchtdorf has a really great talk called "We Are God's Hands," and like we make God real in the world, independent of anything else. My next thing is, I believe that humans function as God. Like pretty crappy gods for the most part, but humans function as God. Especially with technology, this is called transhumanism. So humans are God is humanism. Transhumanism is humans plus technology are God. As my 10-year-old says, we can raise the dead, but only for a few minutes. You know, so again, like, we can work miracles. We are literally working a miracle right now in this communication, because we are communicating across time zones and across time. And I mean, like, you are literally in the future. Like, I am talking to this evening.
Sure.
Right. And then my 4th idea of God is an alien, which is Mormon. Like, the Mormon God is an alien, as is Superman. So I believe that it's very probable that there are aliens that are so advanced that we would experience them as gods. So you can see by, and I have one more, but you can see by now that I take a very functionalist approach to God. And I did a presentation called Beyond the God Debates, because most debates about God are like very intelligent evangelical Christian debates a cynical materialist atheist. And that makes reasonably good entertainment, but it's very bad philosophy, and it's very bad theology. And so, and then my 5th most optimistic belief in God is the oversoul that Jung believed. So I believe that even as, so we are conscious, like, we don't completely understand why or how, but we are demonstrably conscious. Even if we're in a computer simulation, we are experiencing consciousness, right? So as best as we can tell, consciousness is a complex phenomenon from lower order systems. And so I think an oversoul could work like that, where all of our consciousnesses could create a super soul that would be God. And so currently, and I'll finish up how I identify currently, but I currently believe that consciousness is bigger than us. So one of the key questions philosophically, and it's incredibly important, is consciousness an accident? Like, did we evolve in such a way that, whoa, we're conscious for some weird reason, or just natural selection, you know, that we can engage with our environment in more sophisticated ways because we're conscious? Or did we evolve to the point where we can transmit consciousness like a radio? So the radio signal is bigger than the radio. And like you smash up a radio and it doesn't transmit the radio signal anymore. Like you kill someone and all their parts are still there, but they're not transmitting that radio signal anymore. And this is where I have faith. It's called panpsychism, and I choose to believe, and I think it's a very good, powerful working theory that consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe. I mean, we know consciousness is part of the universe, but let me bring it all down to lived experience, and then you can ask a follow-up question. My fundamental question with people in ministry is, what is your relationship to God? And I pray. I actively pray. I did a full moon ritual last night. So for me, I see all religion as ways of accessing our psychology and like an operating system, ways of interfacing from our consciousness to reality. So I like really finishing up my story. I identified as a humanist and I still do identify as a humanist, which is basically like religion as a human aspect of culture, which it is. I'm endorsed by the Humanist Society. Funny enough, the board of directors of the Humanist Society got upset at me for my enthusiasm for religion, which is ironic and funny. I was trained for 2 years as a Buddhist minister, which has been very, very good for me. And I was recently endorsed by Unity Worldwide Ministries. I attended Unitarian Universalism for 2 years, and it wasn't sticky enough. Like it wasn't powerful and rigorous enough for me. So the way, kind of coming full circle, what I would identify as is a lifist, which is a term that I invented, which is like I am devoted to life and thriving and the conscious experience. Like the sustainable well-being of conscious life is the goal that I want to work toward. And what I want to do, my ministry, is I want everyone to be able to benefit from spirituality and religion, no matter what they believe. I do genuinely love unity Christianity. So unity is roughly contemporary with Mormonism. Unity was founded in the 1800s with some precursors, like Emanuel Swedenborg was influential. And the basic idea of new thought, which is what it's called, if anyone is familiar with A Course in Miracles, that's very new thought. Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, is like a exclusivist new thought. And if anyone is familiar with The Secret, that's like a caricature of new thought. And the basic idea of new thought, and I love it. I was just asked in an interview, what has been the most life-changing religion that I've ever studied? And for me, it's the combination of Buddhism and new thought, because Buddhism was like a palate cleanser, like cleaned everything out, Buddhism, this was so hard for me, but Buddhism taught me to love what is. And non-attachment has been so important to me because I'm an idealist, like I'm a recovering idealist, and that is very, we come by it honestly in Mormonism, right? Because you literally have to fix everything, like fix. So Buddhism taught me to love what is. And I learned that grief is a form of love. And so I can grieve love everything that is unhealthy, and I can invest love in everything that is healthy. So I can invest love in everything good and grieve love everything that is not. Buddhism would say, like, what even is good, you know, good or bad. But Buddhism also taught me I was very challenged, or this was an insight that I had, is explanation is avoidance. Explanation is often avoidance. And Buddhism and ministry together have taught me to put my mind where my feet are, to be more in my body, to be more in the present. And so Buddhism quieted my mind. I meditate 15 minutes most mornings, just completely clear my mind and like float in my body. And it's very, very healthy. And then unity, I found out about unity from a chaplain recruiter, because unity is recognized by the military. Like, humanism is not recognized by the military. I mean, it's an interesting situation where I want to say in the Netherlands, they're humanist military chaplains, not surprisingly. But the United States military, the United States Chaplain Corps, is probably the single most powerful chaplain organization in the world. Chaplain, other than like the Catholic priesthood, which isn't chaplain, you know. And so they allow military personnel to be humanist, but they have no humanist chaplains. And that's unconstitutional. Like, that's like a restaurant inviting vegetarians and only having meat. Like, it's not okay. So I found out about Unity Worldwide Ministries to get military endorsement, and it is the most empowering worldview I have ever come across in my entire life. And I say that as a literal professor of world religions. So here it is in a nutshell. New Thought teaches that you are divine. You don't need to be saved. You don't need to be fixed. You already have everything that you could want. So unity uses the Bible, but it's metaphysical interpretation, which I love, which is the Bible is a symbolic story that teaches you about your own human journey. So unity really is like Buddhist humanist Christianity. Like, I'm home. It really is. And even like, I'm not dedicated to this. It's something bigger, but unity is an amazing, amazing institution. It's not very big, not very powerful, but I love the teachings. So for example, unity teaches that Jesus is different than the Christ, and Jesus fulfilled his Christ consciousness, and all of us have Christ consciousness. And then unity has affirmative prayer. So the basic idea of unity is to train your mind and train your soul. It's like soul martial arts, where you are dedicated to life, you are dedicated to love, you are dedicated to your values. So an insight that unity teaches is that when we say we want something, it's usually a very thin layer of wishful thinking on top of lots of negative thinking. And so you may be like when you apply for that job, you may be like, I really hope I get this job. But underneath, I really hope I get this job is I'm such a failure, and like there's no chance I'll get this. And so our body, like this, it lines up with social science very, very nicely, because like our words reflect what we want to be true, and our actions reflect what is true. So unity and new thought is so beautiful, because it's this idea that you, instead of this perfectionistic, like, maybe if I'm good enough, God will love me and let me into heaven. And there's been a very valid critique of LDS culture, and it is culture in this case, that we don't really accept grace well, you know? And one of my very favorite people, Dan McClellan, I think you're connected to him as well. He wrote an essay arguing that the passage in 2nd Nephi, it is by grace that we are saved after all that we can do. And he works for the translation department, like he works for the LDS translation department. He argued, I have such respect for him. He argued that that passage should be interpreted, it is by grace that we are saved, despite all that we can do.
Meaning also all the negative we can do.
Right.
I guess.
It is a more dramatic, we are saved by grace.
Sure.
And so, and I really believe that there are very healthy ways to live every religion. But I'm really, in fact, I need to, you know, leave for church in about 20 minutes. But I really love unity Christianity because it teaches that you are already divine, you are already saved. And have you ever heard that story? I don't even know if it's true, about Michelangelo's David, where Michelangelo said, all I did was carve away everything that wasn't the David.
Okay.
And I feel like that is the healthiest way to approach spirituality, is that you are already saved. And all you need to do is let go of everything that doesn't live up to your divinity.
And if I may quickly add, I actually have been a student of Eastern thought myself recently, you know, and they don't even have the concept of, you know, saved, or we don't have to be saved from something. There's no, you know, there's no original sin or anything like that. You know, there is, but they do, of course, you know, there is divine nature that we need to then seek via communication, you know, with whatever, the universe or the divine, or and non-attachment. Beautiful idea. But
I want to say one more thing about non-attachment, because non-attachment is misunderstood as detachment or not caring. And that's very much not true. Even before I studied Buddhism, I described my approach, because I'm a very enthusiastic person. Like you've already seen that I'm a very enthusiastic person. My feelings are very, very big. And I called it impassioned Zen, which is accurate. Like that's accurate to non-attachment. So non-attachment means don't want anything other than what is. And so, for example, like one thing that I've cultivated, and I am so much better for it, is I can apply to my dream job and let it go at the same time. I can work as hard as I can. So the way that I think about it is facilitate the fulfillment of your dreams, but don't require the fulfillment of your dreams. So that's non-attachment. Like you can be incredibly hardworking, you can have goals, you can have everything. And non-attachment just means like for you know, goodness gracious, like work for the very best outcome, but don't be attached to any particular outcome. And before I open it up to a little bit of a back and forth, here's my great secret to living, is compassionate, curious acceptance. Compassionate, curious acceptance is the answer to everything. Be loving and gentle, be curious, and that's part of the agnostic wonder, you know. So even in the prison, like even when I'm dealing with literal murderers, you can be curious. You can be like, that's super I mean, like it's really popular, all these crime dramas, right? And then acceptance, which was the hardest for me, which is, okay, in fact, with even the dying, I try to encourage people. So one point that I didn't finish saying is that ministry is about facilitating someone's process rather than fixing them.
Mhm.
Or like one of the most surprising things about ministry is not about getting someone to feel better. That's surprising. I mean, or rather not, it's toxic positivity. Don't get them happy. I mean, it will make them feel better, but you have to go down. My favorite definition of ministry is that ministry does not cure loneliness or pain. It deepens loneliness and pain to a place where it can be shared. And I call this redeemed reality, where my idealism is now very grounded. And I'm so humans are catastrophically disappointing. It wouldn't be too much to say that humans will do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. My actual belief about human nature is that we are as good as we are incentivized and empowered to be. I think that's the actual answer. And that helps me remain constructive, because I can say, okay, where is the motivation and where is the empowerment? And you know this from your professional life. There's nothing more frustrating than your boss being like, I need this by Monday, and then they don't give you the resources to do that by Monday. It's like, if you want me to get it done by Monday, then I need this, and this. So it's that, do as much good as the system allows. And I want to write a book about this. Maybe I'll have time at some point. I mean, I will make time. But my own philosophy, my own target is right relationship, right target, right order, right work. And integrity is my core value. And so right relationship is like, are we in proper relationship with reality, with ourselves, with each other? And then right target, I actually talked with the internet provider service guy for an hour. It was funny. And I blew his mind because he's about to get married. And he asked me for advice. And I said, your own well-being and your fiance's well-being needs to be a higher priority than your marriage. And he's like, what? No. And that's like, I used to want to be married at all costs, but now I understand what marriage means to me. And I literally do weddings and funerals. What marriage means to me, my vow is, as long as this is what's best for us, I will be with you. I will choose you every day. And I will do everything in my power to help this marriage be what's best for us. Mm-hmm. That's right target. So well-being, like systems theory, like what we do as human beings is so life is constantly inviting us into genuine growth, but genuine growth is really bloody hard. And so life is always seducing us to cheat. And so in general, we will cheat until pain doesn't allow us to. Change does not happen until the pain of the pain becomes greater than the pain of the change. And what that means is that all systems want equilibrium. All systems want to stay the way they are, even if the way they are is incredibly unhealthy. And so that's what I mean by right target. Right target is well-being, no matter how hard it is. And then right order means you have to do things in the right order, including start where you are. Start where you are, and then do things in the order that is most likely. Like, for example, don't tell your boss that you're leaving your job until you find the other job.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, unless it's so toxic that you just have to to get out. Yeah. And then right work is do your work, not other people's. And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that living well is very, very simple and very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. So that kind of brings us up to date.
I know you're going to have to leave in a few minutes, but if we can just quickly round this round this up or summarize. Or actually, I have a few more questions. So,
Yeah.
and by the way, what you talked about is mind blowing. It's just that I've been around you for so many years. I already heard these things, you know, many of these things, not all of them. And there were some new cool things that you talked about today for me too. So I appreciate it. But my final two questions would be, number one, how do you, let's say, what is your communal service or worship these days? I mean, do you have any congregation you attend, or how does all that work? And what value do you see in it? And the other question is, what suggestion or what advice would you have for an Orthodox LDS who hears your story? How to look at you? Because it's like, for me, what, you know, when I was the true blue Orthodox LDS, was the only way I could approach these things, these stories, was basically mourning for you, because, you know, grief, because poor soul, I mean, you have put so much stuff in your mind. It's driven you out of the church, you know. So
No. Let's pause there, because that's super important. I never talked about why I'm not active. This is really important.
Go ahead.
I am not active because I feel like God called me outside the bounds of active Mormonism so that I could reach more people. It's that simple for me. And it's definitely been the case where whenever I never lie, but in hospice, I very rarely bring up my own beliefs. And if, like, my name is still on the records of the church, and I still, like, I value my membership.
But would you qualify for a temple recommend today? That is another thing that the, you know, Orthodox LDS will also, you know, ask or think about.
I wouldn't. I literally have, like, coffee at the side of the desk. So this is let's unpack this, because this is really important.
Not that it diminishes you and my site or anything, but I was just asking.
This is really important, and let me gently emphasize that I enthusiastically embrace these questions. And when I started the LDS podcast, one of my Facebook friends asked me 4 questions and said, how is this podcast building the kingdom? Why should an active member support this podcast? And how does this podcast relate to needing to be worthy of the Spirit? And those are all great questions. And I feel like I am still building the kingdom. And I feel like I am on the church's side. And I will always want to be on the church's side. Like, as I said, I want the church to be its very, very best self. And I have a whole approach. I mean, you've listened to my podcast enough that like, I genuinely believe that the way we need to approach religion is a way that helps literal believers thrive. This is probably my biggest difference between me, myself, and Dan Witherspoon. Like, I respect Dan Witherspoon. I like what he's doing. When he did Mormon Matters, he may have moved beyond this, but he was into a non-literal approach to Mormonism. And I'm like, God, no, like, literal Mormonism is the most powerful form of Mormonism. So one thing that I told, I'll give you a handhold, or I'll give the literal believers a handhold. I told my aunt that if, assuming the LDS Church is true, God has put a veil over my mind so that I can reach more people. That allows for the truth of the LDS Church, truth claims, and also it validates my own path. Like, let's say for a moment that the LDS Church is true. And then the other thing that I want to say is, I don't think I have ever lived more ethically than I do now. So even though I wouldn't qualify for a temple recommend, like, I don't attend LDS services anymore, for one thing, if I felt that I have seriously considered reactivating. And I helped my home teachers move, and my home teachers were like, "You are not the normal inactive." I'm like, no. So how people usually respond to me is, because I have the luxury of being a chaplain, they have a really hard time disagreeing with me that I'm not living a meaningful life. Like even if it's reluctant, even members of the church are like, "Wow, like you are living a really admirable life. Like I literally help the imprisoned and dying." Like, I mean, I live the gospel, even though I wouldn't qualify for a temple recommend currently. If I felt that the very best use of my life was to be an active member of the church, I would have no problem reactivating. And I actually had a really interesting talk with my son, who was dating an active member. And he and I had a conversation where he and I are very similar. And he said, "I think I could attend church. The only thing I could not do is believe. Like I couldn't make myself believe." So when I say I'm a devout agnostic, I genuinely mean that. Like I am open to, okay, so this is what I actually believe. I believe that life is more meaningful and we are more connected than anything we can possibly understand. I believe in spirituality. I believe in religion. And by that, I mean, I believe that religion is probably the path to becoming our very best human beings, even to become divine. Like, I believe religion is the path to becoming divine. And by religion, I mean congregational, ritualistic. Like my definition of religion, and you can like rewind this and listen to this again and again if you want. Religion is a cultural system of interconnected beliefs and rituals in the context of community with reference to transcendent reality. And the great secret is that most aspects of culture are religions. Sports is religion, military is religion, economics is religion, politics is religion.
Startup entrepreneurship.
It's all religion. Because we as humans are evolved to be religious. We are evolved to have values, to judge each other, to be in tribes. So I take very seriously, I do feel a bit homeless right now. And my greatest dream in life is, well, I want to like do as much good as possible. But my most ambitious specific goal is to found a monastery. And that will be my home. Like my home has not been built yet. And that's a very common thing with founders, you know, is it gives you that hunger and that drive. Currently, this is vulnerable, but my primary home is romantic relationships, and I'm not in one right now. And that's my core community. And in fact, I've been very depressed this past week, just really grieving. I've been saying to my married friends, including you, like cherish what you have, like really cherish what you have.
Absolutely.
I was completely alone last night. You know, I'm mostly alone, and I'm glad that my jobs are social and I have good friends, but oof, I mean, for me, my community is family, and it really hurts that I can't live into that right now. I mean, I'm getting better and better about like inviting all my kids over for dinner, and I have my three older children have already moved out. My two younger children are with me every other weekend, a long weekend, Thursday to Monday. But as far as religious community, I'm a deep believer in religious community, and I think that we as humans are only effective in community. And so I currently attend Unity Church. Like that's literally where I'm going, and then I'll go to prison. This is my prison outfit.
As a chaplain, of course.
As a chaplain, yeah. Although I do say my time in prison has been good for me. and this folds in to the advice that I would give to active members. And so what I would say to active believing members is, please don't grieve for me. And the response that I usually get from active members is some degree of disappointment, but like a respectful disappointment, where it's like, I'm bummed that like our loss, that like, I'm sad that the church is not benefiting from you, but like, I see and admire all the good that you're doing, because like with my nonprofit work, I want to help improve every religion on the planet. Like, you can't accuse me of not being ambitious. Including, like, I genuinely love the LDS Church. I will admit that I don't feel Mormon anymore. Like, I'm incredibly differentiated. I value my membership, but at the same time, it's not my primary identity. And I'm very, very grateful. In fact, there was a woman called me and wants to look into being a chaplain, and in Utah. And I said, have you removed your name off the records of the church? And she said, I'm going to. And I said, I would recommend not. Like, if you feel like you need to, and this is a question that they're going to ask, that's going to come up, is I can imagine someone asking, Jared, how do you justify having your name on the records of the church if you are literally members of other religions? And a friend asked me when I said I'm a minister, he's like, isn't that kind of apostasy? And I said, that's the very definition of apostasy. And so if the church, and this is very vulnerable, if the church asked me to remove my name from the church, I would. Or if the church wanted to excommunicate me, they could. But until that happens, I value my membership in the church for many, many reasons, including my relationship with my family. And also, like, I'm a very, very strategic person. Like, I try to be as authentic as possible, but I'm also very strategic. And I benefit from my membership. But from an ethical advocacy standpoint, I believe that there are many ways to be a good member of the church. And me cherishing my membership in the church for as long as I can is an act of reverence, as well as an act of activism. So the advice that I would give to active members of the church is pray, search, like, live the gospel, and ask God what the healthiest way to live the gospel would be in your current circumstance. And then the immediate thing to do is build individual practice around that. So for example, I still do scripture study. I mean, I like literally study the scriptures, but also I read all sorts of other books as part of my scripture study. I add meditation to my prayer. I pray in different ways. So first, build a spiritual practice that works for you, and then build a family practice that works for you. And then if you're active, be as productive and healthy in your ward as you can be. Don't be afraid to say no to callings. And now it's the motto of the podcast is challenge and be challenged by the scriptures. And I think, here's what I think we should do with callings. I think a bishop, so let's say we receive a calling, I think we should pray about it and be very, very open to saying yes. If we are very open to saying yes and we still feel a no, I think we should go back to the bishop and we should say, I prayed about it. Because the thing you least expect can be the best thing in your entire life. You know, like teaching world religions was the best thing in my life, even though it's not what I wanted. Much more painfully, my second divorce was in some sense the worst and the most important thing that ever happened to me. And this is one of the great benefits of being an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is the LDS Church does a really, really good job at getting you to participate, whether you want to or not. And they're like, one of the greatest challenges of being human, and digest this, wellness is found beyond preference. Wellness is found beyond preference. And one of the most poignant things about being human is we are terrible judges of what we, like, not only are we terrible judges of what's good for us, but we are terrible judges of even what we want. So for example, on my 43rd birthday, part of me wanted to wallow in bed all day. But I chose to have the birthday I would be glad to have done. So that's what I recommend. Don't say, what do I want in this moment? Say, what will I be glad to have done? So I climbed a mountain with my son. I climbed Mount Olympus. And then I made dinner and I invited all of my children. And in the morning, I didn't want that. I didn't want to do those things. But I'm so glad that I did. But at the same time, I also think live your religion as it should be, not as it is. And be the change you want to see in the world, or paraphrasing Jesus, live as if the kingdom has already come. And I think that there needs to be conversation. It's a valid critique that what I just said is very presumptuous. It could be considered arrogant. But I really believe that everything is in conversation. And I receive feedback very, very well, actually, even though I can steamroll people with the force of my personality and communication abilities. And I try to be careful around that. So that's what I mean. Like, as you engage in your community or in your family, one of the best, I used to lose my temper with my children as well. And I really regret that. And now I do this. I go, and it's cool because that would have been a yell. But now whenever I hold my breath, my kids are like, "What's wrong, Dad?" And they know I'm not going to lose my temper. I'm literally just holding my breath. Yeah. And I'm so grateful that has become my extreme behavior. Like me doing this, that is my extreme parenting behavior. And my kids have said, like, you have become a better dad. Yeah. You know, you have become more gentle. And so, but one of the best things that I've done as a dad, ever since they were babies, I always said I'm sorry. And I always admitted when they were right. Like, even when I was talking to a 2-year-old, I would say, "Oh, wow, yeah, that's a really good point." And okay, so similar, like, live the primary principles. And I have so many essays that I can send to Kenneth, and we can link them or whatever, but repent, be humble, love. And so my ethical equation is our behavior should be defensible to the best version of all those impacted by our behavior, which is really, really clunky. But what that means, the golden rule is love people the way you want to be loved. The platinum rule is love people the way they want to be loved. And the diamond rule is love people effectively. And the problem with loving people effectively is we ourselves don't really know what we need to be well. And this is why my primary passion is, again, the intersection of religion and human nature and the social science of religion. So I am dedicating my life to the scientific study of wellness. And that's what informs all of this, including my individual practice. And it means a lot to me when people say, you know, like, you really walk the walk. And I do live my values and live my religion, which is well-being. You know, like, my religion is just show up and human well.
All right, Jared, it's been good talking to you. I know you have to go to church. I don't want you to be late.
Appreciate it.
I'm thankful for your words of wisdom. There was a lot of wisdom. You're like a, you're like a legit wisdom teacher, a legit guru. So
Thank you.
it's
I've worked hard. I have paid full price, and
Yeah.
it has not been pleasant.
Yes, I know what you mean. And but Jared, seriously, I'm so grateful that you were able to come on today. Were able to share your story, and I know that those who approach it with an open heart will benefit from it. I think that one of the best ways for us to grow and become more divine, even I would say, is to openly listen to other stories, and because that's the way to learn.
Yeah, I agree. And as a concluding comment, I want to, with all the gentle compassion I have, like, if this conversation made you uncomfortable, I'm not sorry. And I really respect that. And I hope that we will all, again, open, curious, compassionate acceptance. Just let this, nurture this conversation like a seed. And, Alma, 32, see how it grows, and put aside anything that doesn't feel useful for you right now. But just let it nurture, just nurture it in your heart. And if you're not in a place to listen at all, or like if you're not even listening and you shut it off, that's fine. Like, we are where we are, and that's okay. And we have to start where we are. But I agree with you that listening with openness and curiosity, and I think it's also productive. Like, I would recommend saying something like, I'm not in a place to use this yet, but a really quick example on my part was a really good friend of mine when I was just in the darkest part of post-divorce depression. He told me, Jared, you realize you're doing this to yourself, right? Like, you could choose to be happy in this moment. And I was not ready for that. I responded very negatively to that truth. Like, it is genuinely true that we can start the path, at least, to training. But I wasn't ready for that, because one of the most powerful things I've ever learned is, this is behavioral economics of religion and spirituality, is if you are not happy, it is because you are receiving a reward more important to you than happiness. And we experience all sorts of rewards more important to us than well-being, and more important to us than growth. And so I just kind of nurture this for, like, when it may be useful at some point. But I appreciate your time too, Kenneth.
Thank you very much, Jared. And I'll be sure to talk to you later.
Sounds
Take
good.
care.